Last night, I heard noises in my yard. Seconds later, my 1-year-old daughter started crying in her crib. I grabbed her, cleared every room in the house, then pulled up our security cameras. Every camera worked perfectly except the footage at 3:33 inches the morning. It was nothing but static. I could not recover the missing minute. So, the next morning, I took my digital video recorder to a security technician. He managed to recover just 1 minute. When it ended, every bit of color drained from his face. He told me to take my daughter and leave right now. I looked at the screen, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and betrayed your trust. My name is Erica, and I am 32 years old. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm a single mother to my beautiful 1-year-old daughter, Amari. Building a safe and secure life for Amari has been my only priority since she was born. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood that has always felt incredibly safe. I chose this house because it has good bones, a fenced yard, and a sense of peace that I desperately craved after a chaotic childhood. That sense of safety was completely shattered last night. It was just after 3:00 inches the morning, and the house was completely silent. I am a very light sleeper, especially since having a baby. Every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind usually catches my attention. A distinct crunch of leaves outside my window pulled me entirely out of my sleep. My eyes darted open. I laid there perfectly still, holding my breath and listening to the darkness. Then I heard it clearly, a soft, heavy thud echoing from the back deck. My heart hammered against my ribs. Before I could even throw off the covers, Amari began to wail. Her cry was not her usual fussy whimper. It was a sharp, terrified scream that sent pure adrenaline straight into my veins. I threw off the heavy quilt, grabbed the solid wooden baseball bat I keep under my bed, and sprinted down the hallway. My bare feet barely made a sound on the hardwood floor. I threw open the door to the nursery, expecting the absolute worst. Amari was standing in her crib, gripping the wooden railing and crying hysterically. I scanned the room. The window was closed and locked tight. The closet door was shut. The room was empty. I dropped the bat and scooped her up, holding her tightly against my chest. I whispered to her, trying to calm her racing heart while keeping my own panic completely hidden. I picked up the bat again and meticulously moved through the entire house. I checked the guest room, the bathrooms, the kitchen, and the living room. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was completely secure. There were no broken windows and no forced entry points. The back door was locked tight. The house was seemingly empty. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just a stray animal outside that startled her, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach simply refused to fade away. After rocking Amari back to sleep, I went into my home office and booted up my computer. I have a state-of-the-art security system installed around the perimeter and inside the main hallways of the house. It is a system I installed myself, ensuring there were absolutely no blind spots. I pulled up the camera feeds from the past hour. The front yard camera showed nothing but the quiet street illuminated by a single street lamp. The backyard camera captured a raccoon scurrying past the deck at 2:45, but showed absolutely nothing after that. Then I checked the internal hallway camera. This camera points directly at the door to the nursery and covers the main walkway of the house. I scrolled back through the timeline. At 3:00 inches the morning, the hallway was completely dark and still. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen tick forward slowly. 3:31分, 3:32分, and then, right at 3:33, the screen glitched aggressively. The clear night vision feed vanished and was immediately replaced by harsh gray static. I dragged the cursor forward. The static lasted for exactly 1 minute. At 3:34, the feed cut back to the dark, empty hallway. Just 2 minutes later, I appeared on the screen, running toward the nursery, holding my bat. Someone had deliberately jammed or deleted that specific minute of footage. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out on my neck. I was not alone in the house. Someone had been inside my home, and they knew exactly how to manipulate my security system to cover their tracks. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in a chair by the nursery door, watching my daughter breathe and waiting for the sun to rise. As soon as morning broke, I packed Amari into her car seat, unhooked the main hard drive from my security system, and drove straight to downtown Atlanta. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. I went to a data recovery shop owned by a man named Calvin. Calvin and I have been good friends since our college days. He is a brilliant tech specialist who can pull deleted files from waterlogged phones and crushed hard drives. I walked into his cluttered shop, which always smelled faintly of ozone and old electronics, and placed the hard drive directly on his counter. I told him what happened and begged him to find the missing minute of footage. Calvin saw the genuine terror in my eyes and immediately got to work. He connected the drive to his diagnostic setup and started running a series of complex recovery programs. He explained that sometimes security systems do not fully erase data immediately, but rather hide it in temporary partitions until new footage overwrites the space. I paced around his small shop holding Amari tightly while the minutes stretched into hours. The suspense was utterly suffocating. Every time a progress bar paused, my heart skipped a beat. Finally, Calvin called my name. He sounded completely out of breath. He told me he managed to rebuild the corrupted file and isolate the missing 60 seconds. He clicked his mouse and leaned closer to the monitor. I watched his face closely as the video played. I expected him to point out a masked stranger or perhaps a simple glitch in the software. Instead, the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. His hand shook as he reached out and forcefully turned off the monitor screen. He turned to me and his voice was barely a whisper. He told me to take my daughter and leave the state right now. He told me not to call the police and not to tell anyone where I was going. His reaction terrified me far more than the static had. I stepped forward and demanded to see the footage. I told him I was not running away without knowing what was inside my house. Calvin hesitated, but he saw the fierce determination in my face. He slowly reached out and turned the monitor back on. He hit play and stepped back from the desk. I stared at the screen as the black and white night vision footage flickered to life. The hallway was dark, but the infrared sensors illuminated the figures perfectly. It was not a masked burglar. It was a nightmare I never could have imagined in my worst fears. Two people crept down my hallway, moving with calculated precision. The first person was Connor. Connor is a wealthy investment banker. He is also my white brother-in-law, married to my biological sister, Tiana. Following closely behind him was Tiana herself, my own sister, creeping through my house in the dead of night like a common criminal. Tiana had always been the golden child of our family, the one who could do no wrong while I was constantly criticized. I watched in utter disbelief as they stopped right outside the nursery door. Connor was holding a heavy black duffel bag. Tiana slowly and quietly pushed the nursery door open, and they slipped inside. The camera angle caught them perfectly through the open doorway. They walked straight over to the diaper bin near the changing table. Connor unzipped the duffel bag with practiced speed. He pulled out thick, heavy stacks of cash bound in tight rubber bands. Next, he pulled out several thick ledgers that looked exactly like offshore banking documents. He shoved the stolen cash and the forged ledgers deep into the bottom of the diaper bin, concealing them completely beneath the plastic lining and the fresh diapers. They were planting evidence. They were setting me up to take the fall for a massive financial crime. But the worst part of the footage was yet to come. I noticed movement at the edge of the screen. Another figure stepped into the frame from the living room area. It was a woman standing watch at the end of the hallway, making sure the coast was clear while Connor and Tiana framed me. The camera caught her face perfectly as she turned toward the lens. It was Cynthia, my own mother. The woman who gave birth to me was standing guard while her favorite daughter and golden child son-in-law planted stolen money in her granddaughter's room. I felt physically sick, and my knees buckled slightly. The room spun around me as the reality of the situation crashed down on my shoulders. My entire biological family had conspired to break into my home in the middle of the night. They wanted to trigger an arrest. They wanted Child Protective Services to search my house, find the stash, and take Amari away from me. They wanted to destroy my life and put me in federal prison just to protect Connor from whatever financial mess he had created. The betrayal was so profound and so meticulously planned that I could not even cry. The tears simply would not come. Instead, a cold and absolute rage settled deep into my bones. My family had always treated me like a disappointment, but I never realized they viewed me as a completely disposable pawn in their games of wealth and status. I thanked Calvin for his help and promised him I would be careful. I carried my daughter back to my car, feeling a new sense of heavy responsibility. I was no longer just a mother protecting her child from the world. I was a woman protecting her child from her own bloodline. As I buckled Amari into her car seat, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my mother, Cynthia. The message was sickeningly sweet and casually demanding. She wrote that I should come over to their estate for dinner tonight because the family needed to discuss some important matters regarding Amara's future. She claimed she was worried about me and wanted to help me out during my financial struggles. They thought I was completely clueless. They thought I was just a naive, struggling single mother who would fall right into their carefully laid trap without asking any questions. They assumed I would show up to dinner, beg for their help, and then be destroyed by the police raid they had surely planned for the next day. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I wiped a single stray tear from my cheek, and my expression turned to pure ice. I looked at my beautiful daughter sleeping peacefully in her car seat, completely unaware of the monsters hiding in our family tree. I typed a very simple reply to my mother. I told her I would absolutely be there. Let the games begin. The drive from my quiet suburban neighborhood to my parents' sprawling estate in Buckhead always felt like crossing an invisible border into a completely different world. The towering ancient oak trees and heavy wrought iron gates of their exclusive community were deliberately designed to keep people like me out, or at least they were designed to keep out the version of me they firmly believed existed. My father, Winston, had built a highly lucrative commercial real estate firm over the past 30 years. He and my mother, Cynthia, valued public appearances and social status above absolutely everything else in their lives. To them, human worth and success were strictly measured by exclusive zip codes, expensive country club memberships, and imported luxury cars. I parked my reliable and modest sedan tightly between my father's gleaming imported luxury sedan and the sleek black sports car belonging to my brother-in-law, Connor. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, taking a very deep breath before unbuckling Amari from her secure car seat. I knew I had to play my part perfectly tonight. I had to be the struggling, exhausted, and completely overwhelmed single mother they all believed me to be. For my entire life, I had been assigned the role of the family scapegoat. I was the dark sheep daughter who never quite measured up to their impossible social standards. They genuinely believed I was just a lowly data entry clerk who was barely scraping by on a tiny monthly salary. They never bothered to ask detailed questions about my actual work because they had already decided on my permanent narrative. My older sister Tiana was their ultimate golden child. She had always been the beautiful, polished pageant queen who did exactly what was expected of her at all times. Her ultimate achievement in their judgmental eyes was marrying Connor. Connor was a wealthy white investment banker who came from an old money family. He was the glittering prize they proudly paraded around at every single church function and elite country club dinner. They essentially worshipped the ground he walked on while treating me like a burdensome charity case they were only legally forced to tolerate. I walked up the wide, pristine brick steps and knocked heavily on the solid mahogany front door. I held Amari tightly against my shoulder, preparing myself for the intense psychological warfare waiting just inside. Cynthia opened the door, wearing a perfectly tailored silk blouse and a highly practiced, welcoming smile. She reached out and patted my arm with a look of highly exaggerated pity. She told me I looked completely exhausted and asked if I was getting any sleep at all with my difficult lifestyle. I forced a tired, wavering smile and told her I was just working incredibly hard to make ends meet and keep food on the table. She sighed heavily, acting burdened by my existence, and ushered me into the massive formal dining room. The long table was meticulously set with fine, delicate china and heavy crystal glasses. Winston sat at the head of the table, swirling a generous measure of expensive amber bourbon in his glass. Tiana and Connor were seated right next to him, looking exactly like a glossy magazine advertisement for suburban aristocratic perfection. Winston barely looked up from his drink when I entered the grand room. He merely pointed his finger to a small wooden chair situated near the swinging kitchen door and told me to sit down quickly before the catered food got cold. I quietly settled Amari into a wooden high chair and took my designated seat at the far end of the table. The dinner conversation immediately revolved around Connor and his recent spectacular financial victories in the market. Winston spoke about Connor with a level of deep pride and genuine admiration he had never once directed at me in my entire 32 years of life. He praised Connor for being an absolute financial genius and for effortlessly managing investment portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. Connor eagerly soaked up the lavish compliments with a highly smug and self-satisfied smile. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and an excessively expensive silver watch that probably cost significantly more than my entire car. He looked exactly like the kind of privileged, untouchable man who would never sneak into a helpless infant's nursery in the middle of the dark night. But I knew the sinister truth hiding behind his polished smile. Tiana chimed in loudly to brag about the brand new vacation home they were currently buying in the mountains. She playfully twirled her heavy diamond necklace and cast a deeply condescending look directly in my direction. She asked in a mocking tone how my little data entry job was going and whether I was still struggling to pay my basic heating bill this month. I kept my voice incredibly low and meek, playing directly into her massive ego. I told her things were very difficult right now, but I was managing the best I could with what little I had. Cynthia clucked her tongue loudly and shook her head with deep disapproval. She said it was a terrible shame I had stubbornly refused to listen to their wise advice years ago. She claimed that if I had just married a sensible, wealthy man instead of foolishly insisting on being independent, I would not be in such a pitiful and embarrassing situation right now. The dinner continued with a relentless and exhausting barrage of cruel microaggressions. They criticized my simple clothes, my modest neighborhood, and my careful parenting choices. They spoke about me loudly as if I was a broken, ignorant child who needed constant monitoring and supervision. Every single word they spoke was carefully designed to tear down my confidence and make me feel incredibly small and worthless. Connor poured himself another generous glass of expensive red wine and offered unsolicited, arrogant advice on how I desperately needed to be more financially responsible. The sheer hypocrisy of a man who had just maliciously planted stolen cash in my home, giving me lectures on financial responsibility, was almost too much to bear. I tightly kept my hands folded in my lap and stared blankly at my plate. I nodded along to their painful insults, flawlessly playing the role of the defeated and broken victim they so desperately needed me to be. As the heavy dinner plates were eventually cleared away by the household staff, the entire atmosphere in the large room shifted dramatically. Winston leaned forward heavily and steepled his thick fingers on the polished wood table. The casual, playful insults completely stopped, and a cold, deeply serious tension took over the room. Winston told me that they did not invite me over tonight just to catch up on family gossip. He stated that the family had been discussing my bleak situation extensively, and they had finally reached a unanimous decision regarding my future. Cynthia reached into a dark leather folder resting on the table and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of printed legal documents. She slid the crisp papers across the polished wood until they rested directly in front of my hands. I looked down at the bold black heading printed on the very first page. It was a formal legal petition for temporary guardianship. Winston spoke with a harsh, deeply authoritative tone that began no argument. He told me that my severe financial struggles and my unstable single-mother lifestyle were creating a highly unsafe environment for Amari to grow up in. He said they could not simply sit back and watch me completely ruin my innocent daughter's future prospects. Cynthia quickly chimed in with her incredibly fake maternal concern. She said they had spoken privately to a very expensive family lawyer and decided it was absolutely best for Tiana and Connor to take primary legal custody of Amari. She falsely claimed it would just be a temporary arrangement until I could miraculously get my disastrous life together. Tiana smiled sweetly and confidently promised she would give Amari the highly privileged and wealthy life she truly deserved. I stared blankly at the dense legal papers, feeling a sickening wave of utter disgust wash over my entire body. This was their brilliant master plan unfolding right in front of me. They planted the stolen cash and the forged offshore ledgers in my nursery last night. They fully intended that tomorrow morning they would send Child Protective Services and the local police to raid my house. When I was inevitably arrested for possessing stolen funds and illegal financial documents, these guardianship papers would guarantee that Amari went straight into the waiting hands of Tiana and Connor. Once they had total physical custody of my daughter, they would have absolute control over my entire life. They could easily force me to sign over the deed to my house and drain my entire life savings just to pay for my mounting legal defense. I realized with absolute clarity that they probably intended to liquidate everything I owned to help cover whatever massive secret debt Connor was desperately trying to hide from his firm. Winston did not wait patiently for my response. He demanded that I pick up a pen and sign the legal papers immediately. I looked at him with wide eyes and softly asked what would happen if I refused to sign away my child. The thin mask of the loving, concerned father completely vanished from his face. His eyes turned incredibly dark and menacing. He leaned closer and told me that if I did not sign the papers willingly right now, they would call Child Protective Services first thing in the morning. He said he would personally testify under oath in a court of law that I was a mentally unstable and unfit mother, and that my home was a highly dangerous environment for an infant. Cynthia nodded in agreement and added that with their immense wealth and high social standing, The courts would absolutely believe their testimony over the word of a struggling single mother. They were openly threatening to destroy me completely and take away the only thing I loved if I did not hand over my baby without a fight. I knew exactly what I had to do in that precise moment. I let my shoulders slump forward heavily and buried my face deep into my trembling hands. I forced my entire body to shake violently as I let out a loud, desperate, and broken sob. I cried exactly the way they fully expected me to cry. I begged them through my fake tears not to take my precious baby away from me. I told them I was trying my absolute best and that I just needed a little more time to figure things out and find a better paying job. Tiana rolled her eyes dramatically and muttered loudly that I was always so overly emotional and utterly pathetic. Winston slammed his heavy hand hard on the dining table and angrily told me to stop crying like a spoiled child. I wiped my fake tears away and looked up at them with a completely broken and defeated expression. I begged them to give me just 3 days to review the dense legal paperwork and get my personal affairs in order. I promised I would sign whatever documents they wanted if they just gave me the upcoming weekend to say a proper goodbye to my life alone with Amari. Cynthia looked at Winston and nodded slowly in silent agreement. They openly exchanged a highly smug look of total absolute victory. Winston agreed to give me exactly 3 days, but warned me severely that if I tried to run away or hide, he would have the police track me down like a criminal. I thanked them profusely, playing the role of the shattered, submissive daughter to absolute perfection. I stood up clumsily, acting visibly dizzy and weak from the severe emotional distress they had just inflicted on me. I stumbled heavily toward the grand hallway, pretending to momentarily lose my balance on the expensive rug. I caught myself heavily on the small decorative entryway table located right next to where Connor had carelessly placed his expensive designer leather briefcase. While my entire family watched me with utter contempt and satisfaction, I swiftly and silently slid a tiny micro-listening device out of my pants pocket. In one fluid, invisible motion, I dropped the tiny audiobug deep into the dark side pocket of Connor's briefcase. I gathered my sleepy daughter into my arms and walked slowly out the heavy front door, keeping my head bowed in fake defeat. They genuinely thought they had backed a helpless, terrified animal into a corner, but they had absolutely no idea. They had just handed the keys to their own total destruction to the most dangerous and capable person they would ever meet. I drove back to my modest suburban house, keeping my eyes glued to the rear-view mirror the entire time to ensure I was not being followed. The familiar streets offered a strange sense of comfort after the suffocating toxicity of my parents' grand estate. I pulled into the garage and waited for the heavy wooden door to close completely before turning off the engine. I unbuckled Amari from her car seat and held her close to my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her tiny heart beating against mine. I walked through the quiet house, double-checking every single deadbolt and security sensor along the way. I needed to be absolutely certain we were secure before I let my guard down. I gave Amari a warm bottle, rocked her gently in the dim, soft light of the nursery, and laid her down in her crib. I stood over her for a very long time, watching her chest rise and fall peacefully in the quiet room. She was completely safe, and I was going to make sure she stayed that way forever, regardless of what my family tried to do to us. I walked quietly down the hall and stepped into my private home office, locking the solid corridor firmly behind me. I pushed aside a messy stack of mundane junk mail and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner mounted underneath my heavy oak desk. A small concealed drawer clicked open, revealing a sleek, encrypted laptop that nobody in the entire world knew about. I pulled it out and booted up the custom operating system. I bypassed the complex security firewalls with practiced ease, typing in my long passwords without hesitation. My family genuinely believed I was a struggling data entry clerk, drowning in endless past-due bills and barely keeping my head above water. They loved that pathetic narrative because it made them feel infinitely superior to me and validated their twisted worldview. They completely ignored the fact that I spent the last 10 years teaching myself advanced coding algorithms and complex financial security protocols during every single spare second I had available. I opened my secure financial dashboards and looked at the glowing green numbers populating the dark screen. The balance in my primary offshore holding account was absolutely staggering to look at. I was not a poor, struggling single mother living paycheck to paycheck. I was the sole anonymous founder and lead developer of a highly secure financial technology payment gateway. I built the software infrastructure entirely from scratch in this very room, working late into the night while Amari slept peacefully down the hall. My payment processing architecture was so revolutionary and efficient that a massive global banking conglomerate aggressively pursued a buyout last year. I sold my proprietary software and all the accompanying intellectual property rights to them, completely anonymously, for exactly $150 million. The massive influx of generational wealth was securely shielded behind a complex web of blind trusts and anonymous limited liability companies spanning multiple jurisdictions. I intentionally kept my massive fortune an absolute secret from my family because I knew their insatiable greed would immediately destroy whatever fragile peace we had left. I drove a cheap, reliable car and lived in a modest, older house simply because I valued my quiet freedom far more than flashy designer labels and elite country club memberships. I was quietly one of the wealthiest women in the entire city of Atlanta, and my biological family was currently trying to steal pennies from a secret billionaire. I took a deep breath to steady my racing pulse and minimized my offshore banking portals. I opened a specialized audio surveillance program that I had custom-built for moments exactly like this. I linked the software directly to the tiny micro-listening device I had slipped into Connor's designer leather briefcase earlier that evening during their awful dinner party. The live audio feed connected immediately, and the crisp sound of a furious argument filled my quiet office space. Connor and Tiana had clearly left my parents' house and were now driving home in his ridiculously expensive sports car. I turned up the volume on my speakers and listened intently to every single word they spoke over the hum of the car engine. The polished, confident facade Connor wore at the dinner table had completely vanished into thin air. His voice was high-pitched and trembling with raw, unfiltered panic. He was breathing heavily, and I could hear the sound of his hands forcefully slamming against the leather steering wheel in sheer frustration. Tiana was crying softly in the passenger seat and begging him to calm down, but her desperate pleas only made him angrier and more erratic. Connor screamed that they were completely out of time and that the federal auditors were scheduled to review his entire portfolio of client accounts at the very end of the month. I leaned closer to the speakers as Connor began rapidly listing out the details of his devastating financial crimes. He admitted out loud that he had secretly embezzled exactly $3 million from his wealthy clients' retirement accounts at Vanguard Horizon Investments. He had taken the stolen client funds and recklessly dumped everything into a highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchange, hoping to quickly double the money and cover his previous market losses before anyone noticed the missing funds. Instead, the entire crypto market crashed unexpectedly, and his massive illegal gamble was completely wiped out in a matter of hours, leaving him with nothing. The money was completely gone, and Connor was now facing decades in a federal prison for massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The sheer scale of his arrogance and stupidity was breathtaking to listen to. I listened in utter disgust as Tiana desperately tried to reassure him that their twisted plan would save them from complete ruin. The dark and sickening truth about my parents' active involvement in the conspiracy was finally laid bare through their panicked conversation. Winston and Cynthia had recently discovered Connor's massive financial crimes when he came to them begging for a bailout. Instead of turning him into the authorities and facing the resulting public humiliation, they chose to protect his pristine reputation at all costs. Winston could not bear the thought of his real estate clients finding out his son-in-law was a common thief, and Cynthia was terrified of being banished from her elite social circles. They secretly took out a massive second mortgage on their sprawling Buckhead estate and quietly liquidated their own retirement savings to help bail him out of his massive debt. But their desperate financial sacrifice was still not nearly enough to cover the massive $3 million hole he had selfishly dug at his prestigious firm. They needed more money, and they needed it immediately to save their precious golden child son-in-law from a lengthy prison sentence and public disgrace. Tiana callously explained the final phase of their sinister plot to destroy my life and steal my assets. They knew I owned my modest suburban house outright because I had proudly mentioned paying off the mortgage years ago, thinking they would be happy for me. They also wrongly assumed I had about $50,000 sitting in a basic savings account meant for a Mars college fund. Their master plan was incredibly evil and meticulously calculated from start to finish to ensure I had absolutely no way out. They purposefully broke into my house in the middle of the night to plant the stolen cash and the forged offshore banking ledgers directly into a Mars diaper bin. By calling Child Protective Services and the local police, they intended to trigger a massive raid on my home first thing tomorrow morning. They knew the authorities would find the planted evidence and immediately arrest me for money laundering and financial fraud. Once I was locked away in a cold jail cell waiting for a criminal trial, They would use the temporary guardianship papers they tried to force me to sign tonight to take full custody of Amari. With Amari safely in their hostile custody, they planned to exploit their new status as my daughter's legal guardians to petition the court for emergency control over all my personal assets. Tiana gleefully told Connor that they would force the immediate sale of my house and drain every single penny from my savings accounts to pay for my supposed legal defense. In reality, they intended to quietly funnel all the proceeds from the sale of my home directly into Connor's empty client accounts at Vanguard Horizon Investments to hide the missing money from the federal auditors. They were perfectly willing to completely destroy my life, send me to federal prison, and traumatize my infant daughter just to steal my modest suburban home and save Connor's fake elite reputation. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient sacrificial lamb to be slaughtered on the altar of their obsessive public image and social climbing aspirations. The sheer magnitude of their calculated betrayal settled heavily into my chest, making it difficult to breathe for a moment. My own mother and father had actively conspired to frame their daughter for a federal crime to protect a white-collar criminal. My sister was eagerly waiting for me to be locked in a cage, so she could steal my baby and sell my home to clean up her husband's disastrous mess. They had absolutely no moral compass and no limits to their bottomless greed. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my entire mind, completely replacing any lingering sadness or confusion. I had spent my entire life trying to be a good daughter, trying to earn their basic respect, and hoping they would eventually love me just a fraction as much as they loved Tiana. Those foolish childhood hopes were now completely dead and buried under the weight of their unforgivable treachery. I was no longer a weeping victim, waiting for their approval or begging for a place at their table. I was a predator, observing my arrogant prey, wandering blindly into a massive trap they could never escape. The audio feed from Connor's car grew suddenly quiet as he pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of their lavish home. I could clearly hear the luxury car engine turn off, and the heavy doors open and close with a solid thud. Connor spoke to Tiana one last time before they walked up to their front door. His voice was cold and completely devoid of any human empathy or guilt for what he was about to do to his own niece and sister-in-law. He commanded Tiana to pick up her phone and call Child Protective Services right now without any further delay. He instructed her to use her absolute best tearful and concerned sister voice to make the report sound credible and urgent. He told her to report that she strongly suspected I was laundering illegal drug money and hiding stolen cash inside my home due to my erratic behavior at dinner. He explicitly told her to make sure the authorities knew to search the nursery carefully and look inside the diaper bin where she had supposedly seen me hiding things. He said they needed me arrested and out of the picture by tomorrow morning so they could finalize the guardianship paperwork before the weekend arrived. I reached out and slowly closed the lid of my encrypted laptop. The bright screen went dark instantly, plunging my home office into deep, quiet shadows. They wanted a war, and they were willing to use the police to fight their battles. They wanted to play games with my freedom and my daughter's safety to cover up their own pathetic failures. I stood up from my heavy oak desk and walked slowly toward the door, feeling the smooth wood under my fingertips. They genuinely thought they were dealing with a helpless, broke single mother who would easily crumble under the terrifying weight of a police raid and family pressure. They did not realize they had just declared war on a woman who could buy and sell their entire pathetic lives 10 times over before breakfast without breaking a sweat. I smiled in the darkness, feeling absolutely no fear at all regarding their impending ambush. The sadness that had haunted me for years was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp and focused determination to see them all burn. I had a lot of work to do tonight to prepare for my uninvited guests tomorrow morning. They wanted to find evidence of a crime in my nursery, and I was going to make sure they found exactly what they deserved to find. I left my quiet home office and walked silently back down the dark hallway toward the nursery. I did not turn on any lights because the glow from the street lamp outside provided just enough illumination for me to see the outlines of the furniture. I stood over the white plastic diaper bin for a long moment. My heart was completely steady, and my breathing was perfectly calm. I was not a terrified victim anymore. I was a highly calculating strategist, executing a flawless counterattack against the people who wanted to destroy my life. I slipped a pair of tight latex medical gloves over my hands to ensure I did not leave any fingerprints on the physical evidence my family had so generously provided. I reached deep into the bottom of the plastic bin, pushing past the discarded diapers and the scented liners until my fingers brushed against heavy canvas fabric. I pulled out the dark black duffel bag Connor had hidden there just hours ago. The bag was incredibly heavy and smelled faintly of expensive men's cologne and nervous sweat. I unzipped it carefully on the changing table. Inside the bag, I saw the thick stacks of stolen cash bound tightly with thick rubber bands, exactly as I had seen on the security footage. There were also several thick leather-bound ledgers filled with dense columns of handwritten numbers and offshore banking routing codes. Connor had meticulously documented his massive financial crimes, and then he had hand-delivered the evidence directly into my home to frame me. I smiled in the dark, empty room at his breathtaking stupidity. I zipped the heavy bag closed and carried it quietly to my master bedroom. I pulled back the edge of the thick area rug near my large walk-in closet to reveal a hidden digital floor safe securely bolted directly into the concrete foundation. I typed in my complex numeric passcode and placed Connor's entire criminal life safely inside, locking it away where no one would ever find it. Now I needed a suitable replacement for the authorities to discover tomorrow morning. I walked out to the living room and pulled out a classic board game from the bottom shelf of the television stand. I opened the cardboard box and gathered every single piece of colorful paper money inside. I grabbed a thick stack of printed papers from my kitchen counter. They were highly detailed instructions and complex recipes for cultivating wild yeast to bake rustic sourdough bread. I found an old, faded black duffel bag in my hall closet that looked remarkably similar to the one Connor had used. I stuffed the bright orange and yellow and pink play money into the bag alongside the bread recipes. I walked back into the nursery and shoved the decoy bag deep into the very bottom of the diaper bin, covering it perfectly with a fresh plastic liner and several dirty diapers. The trap was set and waiting for the morning to arrive. I took off the latex gloves and threw them into the outside trash bin. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the wooden rocking chair beside the crib, watching Amari sleep peacefully and waiting for the sun to rise over the quiet suburban street. The morning light slowly crept through the wooden blinds, painting pale yellow stripes across the nursery walls. I heard the distant sounds of early morning traffic and the cheerful chirping of birds outside my window. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a strong pot of dark roast coffee, letting the rich aroma fill the quiet house. I deliberately did not brush my hair or change out of the oversized gray sweatpants and faded t-shirt I had worn the night before. I needed to look exactly like the overwhelmed, exhausted, and utterly helpless single mother my family desperately wanted me to be. The digital clock on the microwave slowly ticked forward. It was exactly 8 when the aggressive pounding started. The heavy fist slamming against my front door echoed loudly through the entire house, shaking the picture frames on the walls. The sheer violence of the knocking was specifically designed to intimidate and terrify whoever was inside. I took a deep, calming breath and forced my hands to tremble slightly. I walked slowly to the front entrance and peered through the small glass peephole. 3 burly police officers in dark tactical uniforms stood on my porch with their hands resting threateningly near their heavy utility belts. Behind them stood a stern-looking woman clutching a thick manila folder against her chest. She wore a sharp business suit and an expression of profound judgment and disgust. Before I opened the solid oak door, my eyes darted past the officers to the street beyond my driveway. Parked completely illegally near a large oak tree about 50 yards away was a gleaming silver luxury sport utility vehicle. I knew exactly who owned that specific car. Tiana and Cynthia were sitting safely inside the plush leather interior, watching my house through the dark tinted windows. They were waiting eagerly, like hungry vultures, to watch me get dragged out of my home in cold steel handcuffs. They wanted front row seats to my absolute destruction and my ultimate humiliation. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy door open. I widened my eyes in fake terror and let my voice shake violently as I asked what was going on. The lead officer did not even bother to say good morning or offer a polite greeting. He aggressively pushed his way into my living room, forcing me to step backward in fear. The other 2 officers followed immediately behind him, fanning out across the room with their hands resting firmly on their radios. The stern woman stepped inside and introduced herself in a cold, highly clinical tone. She stated she was an investigator with Child Protective Services. She informed me they had received a highly credible anonymous tip early this morning from a concerned family member. The caller claimed I was a dangerous and unstable individual who was actively laundering massive amounts of stolen drug money and hiding the illegal cash directly inside my infant's nursery. She said they had a legal warrant to search the premises immediately and secure the child if any illegal contraband was discovered. I immediately burst into hysterical fake tears. I clutched my chest and began sobbing uncontrollably, begging them not to hurt my baby or take her away from me. I played the role of the terrified, helpless mother, flawlessly falling to my knees and weeping into my hands. I stammered and stuttered, claiming there must be some terrible mistake and that I had absolutely nothing to hide. The officers ignored my desperate crying completely, showing no empathy whatsoever. The lead officer demanded to know exactly where the nursery was located. I pointed a trembling finger down the long hallway. The three officers marched down the hall with heavy, loud boots while the social worker stayed in the living room, watching me with cold, intense scrutiny. I followed them closely, continuing my loud, dramatic sobs and begging them to be careful. The officers stormed into the peaceful nursery and immediately began tearing the room apart. They pulled clean baby clothes out of the dresser drawers and tossed them recklessly onto the floor. They checked under the crib and ripped the cushions off the rocking chair. Then the lead officer marched directly over to the diaper bin, exactly where the anonymous caller had explicitly told them to look. He aggressively kicked the plastic lid open and reached his large gloved hand deep inside. He smiled triumphantly as his fingers grasped the heavy fabric of the black duffel bag. He pulled it out and dropped it heavily onto the wooden changing table, causing a loud thud. The social worker hurried into the room, hearing the commotion. She looked at me with an expression of pure, absolute triumph, believing she had just caught a terrible, unfit mother red-handed. The lead officer unzipped the dark bag with a swift, aggressive motion. He reached his hand inside, ready to pull out thick stacks of illegal drug money to secure his major morning arrest. The officer pulled his hand out of the bag and froze completely. The room went absolutely silent. There was no massive pile of stolen cash, and there were absolutely no forged offshore ledgers. Instead, his large hand was clutching a thick, messy stack of bright orange and yellow and pale pink Monopoly money. He stared at the colorful paper bills in his hand with an expression of profound confusion and mounting anger. The social worker stepped closer, adjusting her glasses and peering intently into the open bag. She reached in and pulled out the printed papers, expecting to find criminal records. She read the bold headings out loud in a flat, completely deadpan voice. They were detailed step-by-step instructions on how to properly feed and maintain a wild sourdough starter culture for baking bread. The lead officer dropped the colorful play money onto the changing table and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. The aggressive adrenaline in the room instantly evaporated and was rapidly replaced by intense, deep irritation. The officers realized immediately that they had been played for absolute fools by a malicious prank caller. The social worker looked incredibly embarrassed and visibly angry that her valuable time had been completely wasted on a wild goose chase involving board game money and bread recipes. She glared at the wall, realizing she had marched into a home based on a petty family dispute. The officers did not apologize to me for tearing up my daughter's room or terrifying me. They simply grumbled under their breath about fake emergency calls and wasting police resources. They stormed out of the nursery, leaving the colorful paper bills scattered across the floor and the baby clothes in a messy pile. They marched straight out of my front door without saying another single word to me. The social worker gave me a tight, uncomfortable nod and followed them out, clearly desperate to leave the embarrassing situation behind her as quickly as possible. I stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the driveway. I watched the police cruisers slowly drive past the silver sport utility vehicle parked under the oak tree. The officers did not even glance at the luxury car, but I kept my eyes locked on the dark-tinted windows. I knew Tiana and Cynthia were sitting inside completely confused and panicked, wondering why I was not being escorted out in tight handcuffs and placed into the back of a squad car. I closed my heavy front door and locked the deadbolt securely. I dropped the terrified mother act instantly, and my posture straightened. I walked calmly into the kitchen and picked up my cell phone from the marble counter. Next to the phone sat a single, bright, orange $500 Monopoly bill that I had deliberately kept aside last night. I placed the colorful paper bill flat on the dark counter and snapped a perfectly clear high-resolution photograph of it. I opened my text messages and selected Tiana's contact name. I attached the bright photograph of the play money and typed out a very short and precise message. I told her that if she really wanted to play games with me, she needed to make sure she rolled the dice first. I hit send and walked over to my large living room window. I pulled the wooden blind back just a tiny fraction of an inch to observe the street outside. I watched the silver car closely. A few seconds later, the bright glow of a cell phone screen illuminated the dark interior of the passenger seat. I saw the distinct silhouette of my sister Tiana looking down at her phone. I watched as her entire body physically recoiled in absolute sheer terror. She threw the phone out of her hands as if it had suddenly caught fire. The silver car aggressively jerked into gear and sped away down the quiet street, leaving dark tire marks on the asphalt. They finally realized they had not trapped a helpless victim. They had just locked themselves inside a cage with a monster, and they had absolutely nowhere to run. I watched the silver luxury car disappear completely around the corner. The satisfaction of seeing my sister physically recoil in pure terror was only the very beginning of my retaliation. I walked away from the living room window and headed straight back to my secure home office. I sat down in my heavy oak chair and picked up my encrypted cell phone. I dialed a highly secure international number. It rang exactly twice before Harrison answered. Harrison is my lead corporate attorney and primary wealth manager. He is a brilliant, utterly ruthless legal shark who orchestrated the $150 million anonymous sale of my financial technology company last year. He manages my massive portfolio of blind trusts and shell corporations with absolute discretion. I did not bother with any polite morning greetings when he answered the line. I told him we had a massive and urgent acquisition to execute today. Harrison immediately switched into his sharp professional mode and asked for the target details. I told him I wanted to purchase the majority shares of Vanguard Horizon Investments. Harrison paused for a brief moment. He warned me that Vanguard Horizon was a highly established boutique wealth management firm catering to old money elites, and a sudden hostile takeover would require massive amounts of liquid capital and aggressive financial maneuvering. I told him I did not care about the upfront cost at all. I instructed him to use whatever aggressive leverage he needed to secure a controlling majority stake in the firm by the end of the week. I explained that my arrogant brother-in-law, Connor, currently worked there as a senior portfolio manager and had recently embezzled exactly $3 million from his own wealthy clients. I told Harrison I wanted to own the entire firm, so I could personally act as Connor's ultimate boss and oversee his absolute destruction from the very top of the corporate ladder. Harrison let out a low, appreciative whistle over the secure line. He told me he loved working for me because I never played small. He promised to assemble his elite team of corporate acquisition specialists immediately and launch a massive financial blitz on the Vanguard Horizon shareholders before lunchtime. I explicitly instructed him to keep my identity completely strictly anonymous throughout the entire aggressive purchasing process. I wanted the current board of directors to know a new majority owner was taking over, but I needed my actual name kept entirely off the public record until I decided to finally reveal myself. Harrison confirmed he would structure the buyout through a complex web of anonymous holding companies to ensure absolute total secrecy. I thanked him and ended the secure call, feeling a massive surge of pure cold power running through my veins. I was no longer just fighting a defensive battle against my toxic family. I was actively buying the very ground they walked on, so I could pull it directly out from under their feet. I sat in the quiet glow of my computer monitors, analyzing the brilliant simplicity of my new strategy. Connor based his entire arrogant identity on his prestigious position at Vanguard Horizon. My parents worshipped his job title more than they valued their own daughter's life. By buying the firm, I was not just taking his job. I was taking the very source of his power and their misplaced pride. I barely had time to set my phone down on the heavy desk before the screen lit up brightly with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed my father Winston's name in bold black letters. I took a deep studying breath and let the phone ring 3 times before finally answering. I needed him to think I was hesitating out of pure fear. When I accepted the call, Winston did not even bother pretending to be a caring father, checking on his struggling daughter. He completely dropped the fake, loving family man facade he wore so carefully at his elite church gatherings and exclusive country club dinners. His voice was a low, vicious snarl, completely devoid of any basic human warmth or paternal affection. He demanded to know exactly what happened with Child Protective Services this morning. He angrily shouted that he knew the police had raided my house because Tiana and Cynthia had been watching from the street. He demanded to know why I was not currently sitting in a cold holding cell down at the local county jail. I kept my voice perfectly small and meek, deliberately stuttering as I answered him. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about and that the police had only found old board game money in Amorous Nursery. Winston let out a furious string of bitter curses over the phone. He realized his incredibly evil plan to frame me for drug money laundering had completely failed, but his arrogant pride prevented him from admitting defeat. He quickly shifted his aggressive tactics and decided to attack me directly with a brutal ultimatum. He told me he was entirely done playing polite family games with a stubborn, ungrateful failure like me. He coldly stated that my massive financial struggles and my supposedly erratic mental behavior were bringing deep public shame and total embarrassment to his pristine family legacy. He told me he had a brilliant legal solution to protect the family assets from my disastrous life choices. He demanded that I immediately sign the legal deed to my suburban house completely over to Connor and Tiana by the end of the business day. He viciously claimed that putting my only valuable asset into Connor's highly capable hands was the only way to ensure Amari would be financially provided for when I inevitably failed at life. He twisted his words to make his blatant theft sound like an act of profound paternal mercy. He was essentially telling me to hand over the roof over my child's head to a man who had just tried to put me in federal prison. Winston confidently threatened that if I did not sign the house over to Connor today, he would personally march down to the family court and utterly destroy me. He said he would hire the most expensive, ruthless family lawyers in Atlanta to strip away my maternal rights completely. He threatened to testify under oath that I was a deeply unstable, negligent mother who presented a clear and present danger to my own infant daughter. He boasted that with his immense community influence and vast personal wealth, the local judges would absolutely believe his lies over the pathetic cries of a struggling single mother. He promised to make sure I never saw Amari again if I dared to defy his direct orders. I listened to my own biological father ruthlessly attempt to extort me and steal my home just to cover up his golden child son-in-law's massive financial crimes. The sheer darkness of his soul was fully exposed in the casual way he used my profound love for my daughter as a weapon against me. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, playing the role of the totally defeated, broken woman. I let out a loud, dramatic sob and begged him not to take my baby away from me. I cried through the phone, telling him I was completely exhausted and had absolutely no strength left to fight his massive influence and wealth. I whimpered that I would do whatever he wanted as long as he promised to let me keep my beautiful daughter. I begged him to show me just a tiny fraction of mercy. Winston let out a dark, arrogant chuckle over the phone, clearly thoroughly enjoying his supposed absolute victory over me. He gloated that it was about time I finally learned my proper place in the family hierarchy and stopped trying to pretend I could survive without his benevolent mercy. He spoke to me as if I was a stray dog that had finally been beaten into submission. He aggressively ordered me to meet them at a specific law office in downtown Atlanta in exactly 2 hours. He gave me the address of a notoriously shady real estate lawyer who frequently handled his questionable commercial property deals. I sobbed quietly and agreed to be there exactly on time. I told him I just wanted this entire awful nightmare to end and that I was willing to surrender everything just to keep Amari safe. Winston smugly replied that I brought all this pain and suffering entirely upon myself by being such a stubborn, massive disappointment to the family name. He told me to bring my state identification and a pen because they were not going to waste any more time dealing with my pathetic emotional drama. He abruptly ended the call without another word, leaving a heavy dial tone ringing in my ear. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, and the fake tears instantly vanished from my face, leaving behind a mask of cold, lethal focus. The heavy silence of my quiet home office enveloped me as a slow, predatory smile spread across my lips. I stood up and walked over to the hidden digital floor, safe securely bolted into the concrete foundation beneath my bedroom rug. I opened the heavy steel door and looked down at the dark black duffel bag containing Connor's stolen cash and forged offshore banking ledgers. I reached in and gently traced the thick rubber bands holding the massive stacks of illegal money together. My family genuinely believed they had just successfully forced me to surrender my only valuable asset to save their precious golden child. They were completely blinded by their own massive egos and bottomless greed. They felt so incredibly powerful bullying a woman they believed was completely defenseless and desperate. They had absolutely no idea they were simply following a trail of breadcrumbs I had deliberately laid out to lead them directly into a devastating federal trap. I closed the heavy safe and spun the dial, locking away the evidence that would eventually seal their permanent fate. I walked confidently into my massive walk-in closet, leaving behind the cheap, faded sweatpants and oversized shirts I wore to maintain my carefully crafted disguise. I bypassed my plain, modest, everyday clothes and reached deep into the very back of the long wardrobe where I kept the garments representing my true reality. I pulled out a sleek, impeccably tailored custom black Tom Ford Powers suit that I had purchased during a private fitting in Paris last year. I carefully brushed my hand against the expensive fabric, preparing my wardrobe for the upcoming week of corporate warfare. The sharp lines and flawless tailoring of the suit were designed for a woman who commanded boardrooms and liquidated empires without breaking a sweat. I was going to let my family experience the intoxicating illusion of total absolute victory today. I was going to let them celebrate their disgusting extortion and praise their own brilliant cruelty. I was going to give them enough rope to hang themselves completely, while I quietly prepared to become their worst possible nightmare. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, holding the exquisite designer suit against my body. I was going to burn their entire fake aristocratic empire straight to the ground, and I was going to look absolutely flawless while doing it. I drove through the heavy afternoon traffic heading toward the address my father had given me. It was not located in the prestigious downtown business district where Winston usually conducted his highly lucrative real estate deals. Instead, the global positioning system guided me toward a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of the city. The building was a faded beige structure with peeling paint and cracked pavement in the parking lot. A flickering neon sign in the window advertised cheap legal services and rapid real estate transfers. It was exactly the kind of sleazy, desperate place someone would choose if they wanted to quietly execute a highly questionable property transfer without drawing any unwanted attention from legitimate legal professionals. I parked my car a few spaces away from Connor's gleaming black sports car and my father's luxury sedan. I took a deep breath and practiced my facial expressions in the rear-view mirror, making sure my eyes looked wide and terrified. I let my shoulders slump forward perfectly, mimicking the posture of a completely broken woman who had just lost her entire world. I walked slowly toward the glass door, feeling the hot pavement beneath my feet, and pushed it open. The waiting room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer screen as she pointed me toward a cramped conference room down the narrow hallway. I walked in and found my entire biological family waiting for me like a pack of starving wolves. Winston sat at the head of the cheap laminate table, looking incredibly impatient and deeply annoyed by my mere existence. Cynthia sat next to him, holding her expensive designer handbag tightly on her lap, as if she was afraid the cheap surroundings might somehow contaminate her. Tiana and Connor sat on the opposite side of the table, leaning close together and sharing a highly smug and victorious look. Connor was nervously tapping his fingers on the table, but his eyes burned with a desperate kind of greed. A sweaty man in a cheap, wrinkled suit stood near a stack of filing cabinets, introducing himself as the attorney handling the transfer. He did not ask how I was doing or offer any basic professional courtesies. He simply slid a single thick piece of paper across the table toward the empty chair waiting for me. I slowly sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chair and looked at the document resting on the table. The bold black letters at the top clearly identified it as a quitclaim deed. It was a legally binding document designed to permanently and irrevocably transfer all of my ownership rights to my suburban house directly over to Connor. Winston leaned forward heavily and aggressively tapped the document with his thick finger. He did not bother to lower his voice or pretend to be civil in front of the sleazy lawyer. He ordered me to stop wasting their valuable time and sign the paper immediately so they could finally put an end to my embarrassing financial disaster. Cynthia chimed in with her fake, sickeningly sweet voice, telling me that I was making the absolute best choice for Amari by surrendering my only valuable asset to someone who actually knew how to manage wealth properly. Tiana let out a short, cruel laugh and loudly agreed, saying that a struggling single mother had absolutely no business trying to maintain a house she clearly could not afford. Connor simply pushed a cheap blue pen toward my hand and told me to sign on the dotted line so he could get back to his highly important executive job. I stared at the pen and let my lower lip tremble violently. I forced hot tears to well up in my eyes and spill over my cheeks, landing directly on the dry legal paper. I looked at Winston and begged him one last time to reconsider. I pleaded with him, telling him that my house was the only true stability my daughter had ever known, and that losing it would completely destroy us. I asked him how he could legally force me to hand over my entire life savings and my shelter to his son-in-law. Winston slammed his heavy hand against the cheap table, making the entire room jump. He viciously reminded me of the terrifying alternative. He threatened me again, stating that if I did not pick up the pen and sign the house over to Connor right now, he would make a phone call to Child Protective Services before I even reached my car. He promised to follow through on his horrific threat to testify in family court that I was an unstable, drug-addicted mother who kept illegal money hidden in her baby's nursery. He told me he would personally ensure that I was locked away in a federal prison while Tiana raised my daughter. The pure evil radiating from my own father was absolutely staggering, but I maintained my flawless performance of a terrified and helpless victim. I let out a loud, dramatic sob that echoed off the thin walls of the cheap conference room. I picked up the blue pen with violently shaking hands. I purposefully made my breathing ragged and shallow, as if I was on the absolute verge of a massive panic attack. I looked down at the signature line on the quitclaim deed, and let a few more heavy tears fall onto the page, smudging the black ink slightly. The sleazy lawyer shifted uncomfortably on his feet, but he remained completely silent, clearly prioritizing the fat envelope of cash Winston had likely paid him to look the other way. I slowly pressed the pen to the paper and carefully signed my legal name with a messy, trembling script. I deliberately made the signature look rushed and terrified perfectly, reflecting the extreme duress I was supposedly under. As soon as the final letter of my name was complete, Tiana aggressively snatched the document directly out from under my hands. She held the freshly signed quitclaim deed up to the fluorescent light, inspecting my messy signature with a massive, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She looked at Connor and nodded happily, signaling that they had just successfully stolen my entire life. She leaned over the table, getting uncomfortably close to my tear-stained face. The cloying scent of her expensive perfume was completely overwhelming in the small, cramped room. Tiana lowered her voice to a malicious whisper meant only for my ears. She told me not to worry too much about my daughter because they would be sure to bring Amari to visit me whenever I ended up living in a dirty downtown homeless shelter. The sheer cruelty of her words was intended to completely break my spirit and leave me utterly devastated. I buried my face in my hands and wept loudly, letting my shoulders shake with fake absolute despair. Winston stood up and aggressively adjusted his suit jacket, looking deeply satisfied with his brutal handiwork. He told me to pack my things and vacate the suburban house by the end of the week because Connor needed to take immediate physical possession of the property. Cynthia did not even look at me as she grabbed her designer handbag and quickly followed Winston out the door, clearly eager to leave the depressing environment behind her. Connor carefully took the signed quitclaim deed from Tiana and placed it reverently inside his expensive leather briefcase, the exact same briefcase where my hidden micro-listening device was actively recording every single movement he made. He looked at me with a cold, arrogant smirk and told me that it was just business. He actually believed he was a brilliant financial mastermind who had just successfully bullied a helpless single mother into saving him from a massive federal prison sentence. I sat alone in the cheap plastic chair, sobbing into my hands, until I heard the heavy glass door of the law office finally close behind them. As soon as I was absolutely certain they were gone, I dropped my hands from my face, and the fake tears stopped instantly. I stood up smoothly from the uncomfortable chair and wiped my dry cheeks with the back of my hand. I walked out of the sleazy conference room, completely ignoring the confused stare of the corrupt lawyer. I pushed through the glass front door and stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sun. I walked calmly across the cracked asphalt parking lot toward my modest sedan, moving with the steady, confident grace of a woman who had just executed a flawless checkmate. I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat, letting out a long, deep sigh of pure, unadulterated relief. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, and a cold, calculated smile slowly spread across my face. My family genuinely thought they had just committed the perfect crime. They believed they had successfully extorted me and stolen my most valuable asset to save Connor's pathetic life. They were entirely convinced that the piece of paper I just signed was the absolute key to their salvation. But there was a massive fatal flaw in their brilliant master plan. A flaw so incredibly massive that it was about to bring the entire weight of the federal government crashing down directly onto their heads. What my arrogant father and my greedy brother-in-law completely failed to realize was that I did not actually own the suburban house I lived in. I had not owned that specific piece of property for over 3 years. Shortly after I founded my highly successful financial technology company, I hired Harrison to restructure my entire asset portfolio for maximum legal protection and total anonymity. I transferred the legal deed of that suburban house directly into a blind, irrevocable trust managed entirely by a massive offshore corporate entity. Under strict federal property laws, an irrevocable trust cannot be altered, modified, or dissolved by anyone, including the original grantor. I had absolutely zero legal authority to sign that house over to Connor today. The quitclaim deed they had just forced me to sign under extreme duress was completely legally worthless. It was nothing more than a useless piece of paper covered in wet tears and messy ink. But the absolute beauty of my trap was not just that the deed was worthless. The true genius of my plan was what Connor was about to do with that worthless piece of paper. I started my car engine and immediately opened the secure audio surveillance application on my encrypted phone. The live feed from the micro-listening device hidden deep inside Connor's leather briefcase connected instantly. I could hear the sound of his car doors closing and the powerful engine roaring to life. Tiana was laughing happily in the passenger seat, completely thrilled by their supposed massive victory over me. Connor told her he did not have time to celebrate just yet because he had a very important meeting to attend right now. He proudly explained that he had previously arranged a massive $3 million short-term bridge loan with a highly aggressive private commercial lender downtown. The only condition the private lender had demanded before releasing the massive funds was solid, unencumbered real estate collateral to secure the extremely high risk loan. I listened with absolute breathless anticipation as Connor confidently drove his sports car straight toward the private lender's secure downtown office. He was literally clutching a completely fraudulent real estate document that he had just aggressively extorted from a woman he falsely believed was the rightful owner. Connor desperately needed that $3 million today to quietly deposit back into the Vanguard Horizon client retirement accounts he had selfishly emptied. He needed to perfectly cover his massive embezzlement tracks before the elite firm conducted their extensive annual financial audit. He had no idea that by walking into that private commercial lending office and willingly presenting a completely fake and legally void property deed as formal collateral, he was actively committing massive intentional federal bank fraud. He was willingly crossing the permanent line from a desperate corporate embezzler into a highly documented federal criminal. He was enthusiastically handing the federal authorities the exact signed and dated evidence they would need to lock him inside a concrete cell for the next 20 years of his miserable life. I shifted my car into gear and slowly pulled out of the rundown parking lot, feeling an immense wave of dark satisfaction washing over my entire body. I had successfully handed my arrogant brother-in-law the exact loaded weapon he needed to completely destroy himself. All I had to do now was sit back and watch him happily pull the trigger. The bright afternoon sun beat down on the pristine sidewalks of the Buckhead shopping district as Tiana and Cynthia strutted through the glass doors of the most exclusive designer boutiques in the city. I was entirely aware of their movements, because Tiana could never resist the urge to loudly broadcast her fake aristocratic life all over social media. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. The heavy, crushing burden of pending federal prison had been entirely lifted from their shoulders and rapidly replaced by an overwhelming sense of arrogant invincibility. They genuinely believed they had just successfully executed the perfect extortion against a weak and defenseless family member. To celebrate their massive victory over me, they decided to embark on a sickeningly extravagant shopping spree using the very credit cards they had been terrified of losing just 24 hours ago. Cynthia marched through the high-end department stores, demanding the absolute best service from the retail workers. While she casually browsed through racks of imported silk and heavily beaded evening gowns, she acted like royalty, holding her head high and speaking to the staff with a deeply condescending tone. Tiana was right beside her, swiping her platinum credit card for a massive haul of designer shoes and custom jewelry. They were specifically shopping for the upcoming Vanguard Horizon Gala scheduled for that weekend. They wanted to look absolutely flawless when they stood in front of the financial elite of Atlanta. While they were sipping complimentary champagne in the private fitting room of a luxury boutique, they coincidentally ran into several wealthy women from their elite church congregation. Cynthia immediately put on her highly practiced mask of pious grace. She smiled warmly and loudly boasted to the other women about her perfect family. Tiana eagerly joined in the conversation, bragging that her brilliant husband, Connor, was on the absolute verge of a massive career milestone. She told the wealthy churchwomen that Connor was guaranteed to be promoted to senior partner at the prestigious investment firm during the gala on Saturday night. She painted a vivid picture of their spectacular success, completely ignoring the horrific fact that she had spent the previous night sneaking into her infant niece's nursery to plant stolen money. They laughed and clinked their crystal champagne flutes together, bathing in the envious congratulations of their peers. They firmly believed they had permanently crushed me into the dirt, and they were happily spending the weekend dancing on my grave. Miles away from the upscale boutiques of Buckhead, Connor sat back in his plush leather executive chair inside his massive corner office at Vanguard Horizon Investments. The heavy coat of nervous sweat that had covered his forehead for the past 3 agonizing weeks was finally beginning to dry. He stared intently at the glowing computer monitor resting on his polished mahogany desk. He watched the final pending status of his massive wire transfer slowly change to approved. The $3 million bridge loan he had fraudulently secured using my legally void property deed had successfully cleared the private lender's bank. He immediately clicked his mouse and initiated a rapid series of internal corporate transfers. He carefully moved the massive sum of borrowed money directly back into the various high net worth client retirement accounts he had so selfishly drained. Connor watched the terrifying negative balances vanish from his screen, replaced by the original staggering sums of client wealth. He let out a long, shaky breath of pure, unadulterated relief and slumped back against his chair. He actually believed he had gotten away with it. He rubbed his hands over his face and smiled a cold, arrogant smile. In his twisted mind, he was a brilliant financial survivor who had successfully navigated a minor setback. He felt absolutely no remorse for stealing from his clients, and he felt even less remorse for attempting to destroy his sister-in-law and infant niece to cover his tracks. He rationalized his horrific crimes by telling himself that he was simply doing whatever was necessary to protect his elite lifestyle. Just as Connor was finally starting to relax, the quiet hum of his office was interrupted by the sharp notification chime of his email inbox. A new message had just arrived, marked with high importance and flagged for company-wide distribution. Connor leaned forward and opened the message from the corporate board of directors. The bold text of the email stated that the firm had just undergone a massive and rapid acquisition. The email proudly announced that a new anonymous majority shareholder had successfully completed a total buyout of Vanguard Horizon Investments. The message concluded by stating that the powerful new owner would personally attend the highly anticipated gala on Saturday night to formally introduce themselves and announce an immediate top-down leadership restructuring. Connor read the words, leadership, restructuring, and his massive ego instantly inflated to an entirely new level. He completely misinterpreted the corporate message. In his supreme arrogance, he assumed the board of directors was preparing to clean out the old executives and promote the top-performing portfolio managers to senior partner status. He genuinely believed this anonymous billionaire was coming to the gala to personally hand him the keys to the kingdom. He laughed out loud in his empty office, feeling completely untouchable. He picked up his phone and called a premium tailor in the city, immediately scheduling an emergency fitting for a brand new $5,000 custom tuxedo. He wanted to look like an absolute king when he shook the hand of the new majority shareholder. Meanwhile, Winston was holding court at his highly exclusive suburban country club, completely surrounded by other wealthy, arrogant men who measured their entire human worth by their financial portfolios. He sat in a heavy leather armchair, puffing on a thick imported cigar and swirling an incredibly rare scotch in his crystal glass. He loudly boasted to the men around him about his brilliant son-in-law, Connor. He bragged that Connor was navigating the complex global financial markets with unparalleled genius and that he was absolutely carrying his investment firm on his back. Winston reveled in the envious looks of his peers, completely unaware that he was loudly praising a man who had just committed massive federal bank fraud to cover up a staggering corporate embezzlement scandal. Winston felt a deep sense of paternal victory, believing he had successfully forced his stubborn, rebellious daughter to surrender her only asset to save the family reputation. He took another sip of his expensive scotch, completely blind to the massive inferno that was rapidly approaching his doorstep. While my biological family was busy drowning themselves in their own shallow vanity and false victories, I was sitting in my secure home office executing the final lethal phases of my master plan. I was completely removed from the loud celebrating and the shopping sprees. I was existing in a state of pure, cold, tactical focus. I was on a highly secure conference call with Harrison and a specialized team of relentless federal forensic auditors. I did not speak with anger or emotion. I spoke with the precise, calculated tone of an executioner preparing the blade. I provided the auditors with the exact routing numbers, timestamp data, and hidden transaction histories I had extracted from the forged offshore ledgers Connor had so foolishly planted in my home. The elite team of federal auditors tracked every single digital footprint Connor had left behind. They found the original $3 million deficit in the client retirement accounts. They traced the massive unauthorized transfers to the volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchanges where Connor had lost everything in a matter of hours. And most importantly, they tracked the brand new $3 million wire transfer that had just hit his accounts this very afternoon. They pulled the paperwork from the private commercial lender and verified that Connor had used a fraudulent quitclaim deed attached to an irrevocable trust to secure the bridge loan. Harrison confirmed over the secure line that the trap was perfectly locked. Connor had successfully committed wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal bank fraud, all within a single fiscal quarter. The evidence was absolute and entirely irrefutable. I told Harrison to finalize the legal preparations and contact the regional director of the Federal White-Collar Crime Division. I instructed them to have their agents ready and waiting in the wings on Saturday night. I was not just going to fire Connor from his job. I was going to completely annihilate him in front of the entire city. The rest of the week passed in a tense, quiet blur of anticipation. I maintained my absolute silence, letting my family steep in their profound arrogance. I fed Amari, bathed her, and played with her on the living room floor, cherishing the absolute safety and peace I had secured for us. Every time I looked at her innocent, smiling face, my resolve hardened into impenetrable steel. They had tried to take my child from me to cover their own greed, and for that specific sin, there would be absolutely no mercy. I packed my custom-tailored black suit into a sleek garment bag and prepared myself for the weekend. Saturday night finally arrived, wrapping the sprawling city of Atlanta in a crisp, cool evening breeze. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel downtown was illuminated like a massive glowing jewel against the dark night sky. It was the undisputed social event of the season for the financial elite of the city. Wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites gathered to celebrate wealth and network with power. The grand entrance of the hotel was lined with velvet ropes and aggressive flash photography. A massive stretched black limousine pulled up smoothly to the curb right in front of the grand entrance. The heavy door swung open, and my family stepped out into the flashing lights of the hired event photographers. Winston stepped out first, wearing a sharp, classic tuxedo and a broad, arrogant smile. Cynthia followed closely behind him, draped in the heavy, expensive silk gown she had purchased during her Buckhead shopping spree, her neck glittering with diamonds. Connor and Tiana stepped out together, looking exactly like the perfect, successful power couple they so desperately pretended to be. Connor smoothed the lapels of his $5,000 custom tuxedo, adjusting his cuffs with ultimate confidence. Tiana smiled brightly for the cameras, completely in her element, as she waved to her wealthy acquaintances walking into the lobby. They walked onto the plush red carpet with their heads held high, their chests puffed out with overwhelming pride, and their minds filled with grand visions of impending wealth and elevated social dominance. They felt like absolute royalty arriving at their glorious coronation. They walked gracefully through the heavy glass doors of the luxury hotel, completely unaware that the soft, elegant red carpet beneath their expensive designer shoes was actually leading them straight toward a brutal and highly public guillotine. The grand ballroom of the luxury hotel downtown was a breathtaking spectacle of extreme wealth and highly curated prestige. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vated ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the hundreds of elite guests. A live string quartet played soft, elegant classical music in a designated corner, while waiters in crisp white uniforms glided effortlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne and delicate caviar appetizers. This was the absolute apex of the city-high society. Every single person in the room was a heavy hitter in the world of finance, politics, or corporate real estate, and right in the center of it all, completely in their element, was my biological family. I watched them from a secure, private viewing balcony, situated high above the main ballroom floor. I stood in the dark shadows, looking down at the glittering crowd through the tinted glass. Winston was holding court near the main bar. He had one hand casually tucked into his expensive tuxedo pocket, while he gestured expansively with his heavy Scotch glass. He was loudly talking to a group of influential city council members, boasting about his supposedly brilliant son-in-law. He puffed his chest out with overwhelming pride, completely intoxicated by his own perceived social dominance. Cynthia stood a few feet away, completely surrounded by the wealthiest women from her elite church congregation. She was elegantly sipping her champagne and delicately touching the heavy diamond necklace she had just purchased during her extravagant shopping spree. She threw her head back and laughed loudly at something one of the women said, playing the role of the perfect wealthy matriarch to absolute perfection. They looked like royalty, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire empire was built on a foundation of cruel lies and active financial fraud. But my eyes were primarily locked on Connor and Tiana. They were aggressively working the room, moving from one group of senior executives to another. Connor looked incredibly sharp in his brand-new custom tuxedo. He was shaking hands firmly, slapping the older board members on the back and laughing with total confident arrogance. He genuinely looked like a man who did not have a single care in the entire world. He firmly believed his massive $3 million embezzlement tracks were completely covered by the fraudulent bridge loan he had secured using my stolen property deed. He was acting exactly like the heir apparent to the entire firm. He strutted across the polished marble floor, treating the senior partners as if they were already his subordinates. Tiana clung tightly to his arm, wearing a deeply smug and victorious smile. She was completely basking in the glowing admiration of the junior partners' wives, looking down her nose at the serving staff. They felt so incredibly powerful standing in that beautiful room, possessing absolutely no idea that the very air they were breathing was about to be sucked right out of their lungs. The soft classical music slowly faded away, and the main ambient lights in the massive ballroom began to dim. A hush fell over the glittering crowd as a single bright spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room. The current chief executive officer of the investment firm, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair, stepped up to the crystal podium. He adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the hundreds of elite guests gathered before him. The entire room went completely silent, hanging on his every single word. Connor immediately stopped talking and turned toward the stage. He grabbed Tiana's hand and squeezed it tightly, his eyes wide with desperate anticipation. He genuinely believed this was the exact moment his entire life would change for the better. He thought he was about to be called up to the stage and handed the keys to the corporate kingdom. The chief executive officer cleared his throat and began his highly rehearsed speech. He spoke passionately about the long, prestigious history of the firm and its absolute commitment to managing the immense wealth of its elite clients. He praised the hard-working portfolio managers and the dedicated staff who had built the company into a massive financial powerhouse. Winston proudly nudged the city council member standing next to him and pointed directly at Connor. The arrogant pride radiating from my father was almost palpable from my hidden vantage point. The chief executive officer then shifted his tone to something much more serious and profound. He announced that as of this week, the firm had officially entered a completely new and highly exciting era. He confirmed the aggressive industry rumors that the firm had just been fully acquired by a massive anonymous offshore holding company. He spoke with deep reverence about the incredible strategic vision and the overwhelming financial power of the new majority owner. He told the captivated audience that this brilliant anonymous investor had executed a flawless and completely ruthless corporate takeover in a matter of days. Connor leaned forward with his eyes completely locked on the stage. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He was fully expecting the chief executive officer to announce that the new visionary owner had specifically selected him to lead the firm into the future. The chief executive officer smiled broadly and asked the entire ballroom to please direct their undivided attention to the grand, sweeping marble staircase located at the back of the room. He proudly announced that it was his absolute honor to formally introduce the brilliant mind behind the massive acquisition. He asked the elite crowd to welcome the brand new majority shareholder and the permanent chairwoman of the board of directors. The heavy velvet curtains at the top of the grand marble staircase slowly pulled back. A massive, brilliant white spotlight instantly swung across the dark ballroom and hit the top landing perfectly. The entire crowd turned their heads in absolute unison, looking up at the top of the stairs. I stepped out from the dark shadows and walked directly into the blinding light. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply stood there, radiating pure, absolute cold power. I was wearing my impeccably tailored custom black designer suit. The sharp lines of the expensive fabric perfectly complemented my cold, lethal expression. I looked down at the hundreds of faces staring up at me, and I immediately locked eyes with my biological family standing in the center of the crowd. The physical reaction from my family was absolutely instantaneous and deeply catastrophic. Tiana was standing completely frozen with her mouth slightly open. The expensive crystal champagne flute she was holding simply slipped right out of her loose fingers. It hit the hard marble floor with a loud, sharp crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sudden violent noise echoed loudly in the quiet room, but nobody even looked at the broken glass. They were all staring at me. Cynthia's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She physically stumbled backward and had to grab the edge of a tall cocktail table just to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, realizing the magnitude of her fatal miscalculation. Winston was completely paralyzed. His expensive scotch glass was frozen halfway to his mouth. His eyes were wide and completely terrified as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible image standing in front of him. The struggling, helpless single mother he had just brutally extorted was now standing above him as a billionaire corporate titan. But Connor's reaction was the absolute best of all. The arrogant, smug smile completely melted off his face in a fraction of a second. Every single drop of blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like pale gray ash. His knees actually buckled slightly, and he had to grab Tiana's arm just to stay upright. His eyes darted around the room in absolute sheer panic. In that one single devastating moment, Connor realized everything. He realized the anonymous corporate buyout was not a lucky career opportunity. He realized the sudden availability of the private bridge loan was not a lucky coincidence. He realized that the quiet, submissive sister-in-law he had just tried to frame for a federal crime was actually the apex predator who now entirely owned his entire life. The sheer magnitude of his massive fatal mistake crashed down on his shoulders with the heavy, crushing weight of a collapsing building. I slowly took my first step down the grand, sweeping marble staircase. The room was so incredibly quiet that the sharp, confident click of my expensive heels echoed clearly across the massive ballroom. I kept my posture perfectly straight, and my eyes locked dead ahead. The crowd of wealthy elites naturally parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide open path directly from the bottom of the stairs to the main stage. I walked with slow, deliberate purpose. I did not rush. I wanted every single second of their terror to stretch out and burn deeply into their minds. I walked directly past my paralyzed family. I was close enough to smell the cheap fear sweating out of Connor's pores. I did not stop, and I did not say a single word to them. I simply gave them one brief, freezing look of absolute total destruction as I glided past. I stepped gracefully up the short stairs to the main stage and walked directly over to the crystal podium. The chief executive officer nervously stepped back, giving me total control of the room. I reached out and gently tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thud echoed loudly over the massive speaker system, ensuring every single person in the room was listening closely. I looked out at the sea of pale, terrified faces belonging to my family, and I smiled a cold, lethal smile. I leaned softly into the microphone and let my voice carry through the silent ballroom. Good evening. Let us talk about transparency. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. It was the kind of profound, heavy quiet that only occurs when hundreds of incredibly powerful people simultaneously hold their breath. I stood behind the crystal podium, looking out over the sea of expensive evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to command their absolute attention. The microphone picked up my calm, steady tone and projected it clearly across the massive space. I told the glittering crowd that true wealth management is built entirely on a foundation of absolute trust and unwavering transparency. I explained that as the new majority shareholder of Vanguard Horizon Investments, my very first priority was to conduct a comprehensive independent forensic audit of the entire firm. I reached out and gently pressed a small button on the sleek wireless remote resting on the podium. The massive high-definition projector screen suspended behind the stage instantly flickered to life. The elite crowd was fully expecting to see a slick, highly produced corporate promotional video filled with smiling families and ascending profit graphs. Instead, the massive screens illuminated the dark ballroom with stark clinical spreadsheets. Row after row of dense financial data filled the bright displays. The black numbers were heavily punctuated by aggressive blocks of bright red highlighting. A collective murmur of deep confusion rippled through the wealthy audience. I let them stare at the raw data for a few moments, allowing the reality of the situation to slowly sink into their minds. Then I began to speak again using the precise clinical tone of a surgeon dissecting a terminal illness. I directed their attention to the upper left corner of the massive screens. I highlighted a specific group of high net worth retirement portfolios. These were the secured accounts of elderly clients who had trusted this prestigious firm with their entire life savings. I walked the captivated audience through the timeline. I showed them exactly how a series of highly unauthorized and deeply concealed transfers began bleeding those specific accounts dry over the past fiscal quarter. I explained the mechanics of the theft, breaking down the complex financial maneuvers into simple, undeniable facts. I showed them how the stolen client funds were methodically siphoned out of the secure Vanguard Horizon network and funneled directly into a labyrinth of volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. I displayed the exact dates and the precise timestamps of every single illegal transaction. The confusion in the grand ballroom rapidly transformed into a rising tide of genuine alarm. These were wealthy investors, business mogul, and local politicians who suddenly realized they were looking at a massive financial crime occurring inside their own trusted institution. The quiet murmurs grew into sharp, anxious whispers. People began setting their crystal champagne flutes down on the cocktail tables, entirely losing their appetite for celebration. I pressed the remote button again. The screen shifted to display a staggering negative balance. I spoke clearly into the microphone, stating that the total amount of stolen client capital amounted to exactly $3 million. Furthermore, I explained that the offshore cryptocurrency markets had recently crashed, completely wiping out the entire stolen sum in a matter of hours. The money was completely gone, and the secure retirement portfolios had been left completely hollowed out by a desperate, reckless gamble. The tension in the room was absolute. I looked directly at the center of the crowd, where my biological family was standing completely frozen in terror. Tiana looked like she was about to be physically sick. Cynthia was gripping the edge of a table, her knuckles completely white. Winston was staring at the massive screens with his mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the disastrous data being presented to his wealthy peers, and Connor was physically shaking. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He knew exactly what was coming next, and he was utterly powerless to stop it. I told the anxious crowd that a crime of this massive magnitude could not be executed by an outsider. It required highly elevated security clearance, deep internal system knowledge, and direct trusted access to the specific client portfolios. I pressed the button on my remote for the third time. The massive screens shifted once again. This time, they displayed highly detailed internal network logs, digital authorization signatures, and private routing numbers. The data clearly linked every single fraudulent offshore transfer directly back to one specific internal corporate workstation. I did not scream his name. I did not point my finger. I simply spoke his name with lethal professional calm. I announced to the entire room that the senior portfolio manager responsible for the massive $3 million embezzlement was Connor. The collective gasp that erupted from the hundreds of elite guests actually echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Every single head in the massive ballroom violently snapped around to look directly at the center of the room. The physical reaction from the high society crowd was immediate and absolutely merciless. The senior board members of Vanguard Horizon Investments, who had been happily shaking Connor's hand just 10 minutes ago, physically stepped backward away from him. They moved quickly, retreating as if he was suddenly highly radioactive. The wealthy wives from Cynthia's elite church congregation gasped and covered their mouths, stepping away from Tiana and her mother. In a matter of seconds, my family was left standing completely alone, isolated in the center of a wide, empty circle of polished marble floor. The social exile was instantaneous and absolute. Connor was drowning in pure public humiliation. The thick, heavy coat of arrogant confidence he had worn his entire life completely evaporated. He looked around wildly at the disgusted faces of the most powerful people in Atlanta. He saw the senior partners staring at him with pure legal rage. He saw his prestigious career, his fake aristocratic identity, and his absolute freedom burning to ashes right in front of his eyes. Pure animal panic completely overtook his rational thought. He dropped Tiana's hand and aggressively shoved his way past a stunned city council member. He broke into a desperate, terrified run, heading straight toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom. He was trying to flee the public execution, hoping to escape into the downtown streets and disappear into the night. He did not even make it halfway across the room. I had prepared for every single possible contingency. As Connor desperately lunged toward the exit, the heavy mahogany doors smoothly swung shut. 4 massive, highly trained private security contractors stepped directly in front of the exit, blocking his path completely. They wore sharp black suits and crossed their arms over their broad chests, forming an impenetrable human wall. Connor slammed to a sudden halt, his expensive leather shoes sliding slightly on the polished floor. He looked at the mass of security guards and then looked back frantically toward the stage. He was completely trapped inside a gilded cage of his own making, with hundreds of his former peers watching his pathetic downfall. The overwhelming shock of the moment finally broke Winston's paralysis. My father simply could not handle the rapid, catastrophic destruction of his carefully curated public image. He could not accept that his precious golden child son-in-law was a common thief, and he absolutely could not accept that the daughter he so deeply despised was the powerful billionaire orchestrating the destruction. His massive ego violently rejected the reality unfolding in front of him. He stepped forward into the empty circle, separating himself from Cynthia and Tiana. His face was bright red with furious indignation. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly up at the stage and shouted at the top of his lungs. His deep voice boomed over the hushed whispers of the wealthy crowd. He completely abandoned any shred of professional decorum. He screamed that this entire presentation was a massive, fraudulent lie. He shouted to the board of directors that they were making a terrible mistake by listening to me. He aggressively pointed at me and yelled that I was nothing but a deeply jealous, bitter, and completely broke single mother. He claimed I was mentally unstable and that I had meticulously fabricated this entire complex financial presentation purely out of spite, just to ruin his successful family. He desperately pleaded with the elite crowd, telling them that Connor was a brilliant, honest man who was being maliciously framed by a deeply disturbed woman who could not even afford to pay her own basic living expenses. He loudly demanded that the hotel staff immediately cut the power to the massive projector screens and called the local police to have me arrested for criminal defamation and public trespassing. I stood perfectly still behind the crystal podium and allowed my father to scream his desperate, pathetic lies into the cavernous room. I absorbed every single vicious insult he hurled at me without flinching. I watched him completely humiliate himself in front of the very high society peers he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The wealthy investors and politicians simply stared at him with profound pity and deep discomfort. Realizing they were witnessing a man experiencing a total psychological collapse, he was desperately clinging to a fake reality that had already been permanently shattered. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there panting heavily in his expensive tuxedo, the grand ballroom descended back into absolute heavy silence. I looked down at the man who had spent 32 years making me feel completely worthless. I looked at the father who had happily threatened to take my infant daughter away from me just to protect a white-collar criminal. I did not feel any anger toward him anymore. I only felt a cold, absolute detachment. I leaned slowly into the microphone, making sure my voice would carry clearly to every single corner of the massive, quiet room. I smiled a cold, lethal smile. "I am not broke, Dad," I said into the mic, "and I am not finished. Turn your attention back to the screen. Let's look at what Connor does at 3:33 a.m. The massive screens behind me went entirely black for a fraction of a second. The high-definition projectors then illuminated the dark ballroom with the stark, grainy night vision footage from my home security system. The wealthy audience stared up at the two 0-foot displays in absolute silence. They saw the long, narrow hallway of my modest suburban home. In the bottom corner of the massive screens, the digital timestamp ticked forward in glowing white numbers. 3:31, 3:32, 3:33 inches the morning. Two figures crept into the frame. Even in the grayscale night vision, their identities were absolutely unmistakable. The entire grand ballroom let out a collective gasp of pure visceral horror as they recognized the polished, handsome face of Connor and the elegant profile of my sister Tiana. They were not dressed for a high society gala. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving with the calculated stealth of common street criminals. Connor was tightly gripping a heavy dark duffel bag, but the elite crowd had not even processed that initial shock before a third figure stepped into the frame. A wave of disgusted whispers rippled through the wealthy church members standing near the front of the stage. They watched in sheer disbelief as my mother Cynthia stepped cautiously into the hallway. The pious, wealthy matriarch, who had just been sipping expensive champagne and boasting about her perfect family, was now standing on the screen, acting as a vigilant lookout for a midnight burglary. She nervously scanned the dark living room, ensuring the coast was completely clear while her children committed a felony. The camera angle shifted perfectly as Connor and Tiana pushed open the door to the nursery. The audience could clearly see the edges of my daughter's white wooden crib in the background. The elite crowd watched with mounting sickness as Connor unzipped the heavy bag. He pulled out the thick bound stacks of stolen client cash and the forged offshore banking ledgers. He walked directly over to the diaper bin located just feet away from where my innocent 1-year-old baby was peacefully sleeping. He aggressively shoved the stolen evidence deep into the bottom of the bin, concealing it beneath the plastic lining. I leaned into the crystal podium and let my voice echo through the massive room. I told the horrified crowd exactly what they were witnessing. I explained that my own biological sister and my brother-in-law broke into my home in the dead of night to plant the stolen $3 million directly inside my infant sanctuary. I explained that my mother stood watch in the hallway to ensure the framing went flawlessly. I told the captive audience that they orchestrated this entire malicious break-in to trigger a massive police raid on my home the very next morning. They wanted to send me to a federal prison and use Child Protective Services to rip my baby out of my arms, just to cover up Connor's disastrous financial crimes. The disgust in the grand ballroom was absolutely palpable. The wealthy investors and powerful politicians looked at my family as if they were looking at actual monsters. To steal money was a terrible crime, but to weaponize the safety of an innocent sleeping infant, to cover up that crime was an act of profound, unforgivable evil. The social destruction of my family was completely absolute. The elite crowd physically backed away from them, leaving Winston, Cynthia, Tiana, and Connor completely isolated in a wide circle of polished marble floor. I turned my cold gaze directly down at Connor. He was physically trembling so violently that he could barely stand upright. The arrogant investment banker was completely shattered. I spoke clearly into the microphone, telling him that his brilliant extortion plan at the sleazy downtown law office was nothing but a massive fatal illusion. I told him he thought he had completely broken me when he forced me to sign over the deed to my suburban house. He truly believed he had stolen my only valuable asset to secure a bridge loan and hide his massive embezzlement tracks before the upcoming corporate audit. I smiled a very slow, lethal smile. I told Connor that I did not actually own that suburban house. I explained to the breathless crowd that I had transferred the legal deed of that property into a blind, irrevocable trust over 3 years ago. I had absolutely no legal authority to sign that house over to anyone. The quitclaim deed I had signed with trembling hands and fake tears was completely legally worthless. It was nothing more than a useless piece of paper. I watched Connor's eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror as the reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. I explained the final masterstroke of my trap. I told him that the worthless piece of paper was not the actual crime. The crime was what he did with that paper next. I told the silent room that Connor had marched directly into a private commercial lending office yesterday afternoon. He presented that fraudulent voided deed as legitimate, unencumbered real estate collateral to secure a massive $3 million short-term loan. He signed binding legal declarations claiming he was the rightful owner of the property. I leaned closer to the microphone and let my words slice through the air like a razor. I told Connor that the commercial lender he used was federally backed by the government. I told him that using a forged, extorted document to secure millions of dollars from a federally backed institution was no longer just a simple case of corporate embezzlement. It was a massive intentional act of federal bank fraud. He had willingly handed the federal government a signed, documented confession. He had locked the doors of his own prison cell and handed me the only key. Connor let out a choked, desperate sound that was half sob and half scream. His knees completely buckled beneath him, and he collapsed heavily onto the polished marble floor. He buried his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably in front of the most powerful people in the city. His expensive custom tuxedo crumpled around his shaking shoulders. He was a completely broken, ruined man. At that exact precise moment, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom violently burst open. The loud, sudden noise made the entire crowd jump in shock. A large, coordinated team of stern-looking federal agents in dark suits and local police officers in full tactical uniforms marched aggressively into the elegant room. They moved with swift, terrifying purpose straight down the center aisle. The sea of wealthy guests scrambled to get out of their way, desperately pressing themselves against the walls and cocktail tables to avoid any association with the aid. The federal agents reached the center of the room and immediately surrounded Connor. 2 agents grabbed him by the arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. They slammed him face-first down onto a nearby cocktail table, shattering several crystal champagne flutes in the process. They aggressively pulled his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. An agent loudly read him his Miranda rights, informing him he was under federal arrest for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive bank fraud. But the authorities were not finished. Tiana was standing a few feet away, screaming hysterically, and begging the officers to let her husband go. 2 female police officers immediately flanked her. They grabbed her wrists and forcefully pulled her arms behind her back. Tiana shrieked in absolute sheer terror as the cold steel handcuffs locked tightly around her own wrists. The officers loudly informed her she was under arrest for criminal conspiracy, filing false police reports, and filing fraudulent Child Protective Services claims. Tiana thrashed and sobbed her expensive silk designer gown, tearing slightly at the shoulder as she completely lost her mind. Then 2 more federal agents stepped directly toward my mother. Cynthia was completely paralyzed with shock. The wealthy, pious matriarch, who had spent her entire life judging everyone else from her high horse, was now standing face to face with federal law enforcement. She tried to step backward, shaking her head in denial, but the agents moved swiftly. They grabbed her wrists and secured the heavy handcuffs. The ultimate public humiliation was complete. Cynthia was being arrested in front of her entire elite church congregation and all her wealthy country club friends for conspiring to frame her own daughter for a federal crime. The perfectly manicured image she had spent decades building was entirely destroyed in a matter of seconds. She looked around at the women she had shopped with just days ago and saw nothing but profound disgust and brutal judgment in their eyes. Cynthia broke down into ugly, desperate sobs. The pristine mask she had worn for decades was entirely gone. She twisted against the handcuffs and looked wildly at my father. She begged Winston to do something to call his expensive lawyers, to use his massive political influence to stop this nightmare. But Winston was completely powerless. He nervously reached into his pocket for his phone, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it onto the hard marble floor. He stared at the shattered screen, realizing that his real estate empire and his social connections meant absolutely nothing against a coordinated federal raid. His money could not buy him out of this absolute disaster. Winston slowly turned his head and looked up at the grand stage. He looked directly into my eyes. His face was pale and slick with nervous sweat. He looked like a shattered, pathetic old man. He raised his shaking hands toward me and pleaded with a broken, trembling voice. He begged me for mercy, telling me that these people were my blood and my family. He begged me to make it stop. I looked down at him from my crystal podium. I felt absolutely no pity and no remorse. I simply looked away from his desperate, pleading face, picked up my glass of ice water from the podium, and took a slow, refreshing sip. The cold glass pressed against my lips as I took a slow, refreshing sip of ice water. I looked down from the crystal podium and watched the federal agents physically drag my biological family toward the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom. The complete destruction of their carefully crafted aristocratic illusion was finally absolute. Winston stood completely frozen in the center of the room with his arms hanging limply at his sides. He watched his pious wife and his golden child daughter being hauled away in heavy steel handcuffs. Tiana was fighting wildly against the strong grip of the female police officers. Her expensive designer silk gown tore even further along the shoulder seam as she thrashed and kicked at the polished marble floor. She twisted her neck and locked her terrified eyes directly onto me. She began screaming hysterically across the silent room. She screamed that we were blood. She cried out that we were family, and that I could not do this to my own sister. I set my glass of water down on the podium and slowly walked down the short steps from the stage. The wealthy crowd of investors and politicians parted widely to give me a clear path. I walked with deliberate, measured steps until I stood only 2 feet away from my sister. The federal agents paused for a brief moment, allowing me to look directly into her panicked eyes. Tiana was sobbing heavily with black mascara running down her flushed cheeks, begging me to tell the officers it was all a big misunderstanding. I looked at her completely ruined face and felt absolutely nothing. My voice was perfectly calm and lethal when I finally spoke to her. I told her that family protects you at 3:00 inches the morning. I told her that she actively tried to destroy my innocent child to save a thief. I stated clearly that my bloodline starts with my daughter Amari, and it absolutely ends with me. I told Tiana that she and the rest of them were completely nothing to me now. I gave the federal agents a short nod, and they immediately pulled Tiana and Cynthia through the large doors and out into the cold night air. Connor was already gone, loaded into the back of a dark federal transport vehicle. Winston simply turned around and walked out of the ballroom alone, a completely broken and pathetic shadow of the arrogant man he used to be. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, bringing an absolute end to the reign of my toxic family. Exactly 1 year has passed since that unforgettable night at the luxury hotel downtown. The immense fallout from the federal raid was spectacularly brutal and entirely permanent. The legal justice system moves slowly, but it moves with absolute crushing certainty when presented with irrefutable evidence. Connor never even made it to a criminal trial. His highly expensive defense attorneys looked at the massive mountain of forensic financial audits and the damning night vision security footage and advised him to accept a plea deal immediately. He stood before a federal judge in a bright orange prison jumpsuit, completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his arrogant investment banker pride. The federal prosecutors piled on charges for the $3 million embezzlement and the massive bank fraud carrying heavy mandatory minimums. The federal judge showed absolutely no mercy to a man who stole millions from elderly retirees and attempted to frame a single mother for his crimes. Connor was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He spends his days locked inside a small concrete cell, completely isolated from the wealthy high society world he once believed he ruled. His former elite friends completely abandoned him the moment the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists. The devastating consequences for Winston and Cynthia were equally absolute and deeply humiliating. They tried desperately to fight the criminal conspiracy charges and the civil lawsuits filed by the defrauded pensioners in the federal government. They hired the most expensive defense lawyers in Atlanta, draining every single penny they had left in their secret offshore accounts. But the legal fees and the massive civil damages completely consumed their entire remaining fortune. The federal government and the commercial banks seized their sprawling luxury estate in Buckhead to pay off the massive financial penalties. I heard through my corporate lawyers about their humiliating moving day when they were forced to pack their few remaining belongings into black plastic garbage bags because they could not even afford to hire professional movers. They were completely evicted from the massive mansion where they had spent decades judging and looking down on everyone else. Winston and Cynthia now live in a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. Their new apartment constantly smells of mildew and old cooking oil. The wealthy elite church congregation they once proudly dominated completely shunned them the very morning after the gala. Cynthia actually tried to attend a Sunday service a few weeks later and was publicly turned away at the heavy wooden doors by the pastor himself. The exclusive country club revoked Winston's membership and banned him from the premises entirely. Their former high society friends pretend they do not even exist, walking to the other side of the street if they happen to see them in public. They have absolutely zero social standing and zero wealth left to hide behind. They spend their miserable days trapped in a tiny, humid apartment, blaming each other for their total absolute ruin. Tiana experienced the most drastic and humiliating fall from grace out of all of them. When Connor went to federal prison, she was left completely alone to deal with the massive mountain of secondary debt he had secretly accumulated. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy just 3 months after the ballroom raid. All of her expensive designer clothes, her custom jewelry, and her luxury shoes were seized and liquidated to pay off her angry creditors. She avoided serving prison time for her part in the conspiracy only by accepting a highly restrictive plea deal that requires her to complete thousands of hours of intense physical community service and submit to regular strict psychological testing. The glamorous golden child who once boasted about buying mountain vacation homes and wearing thick diamonds is now working a minimum wage retail job at a massive discount clothing store in a struggling suburban mall. She spends her long, exhausted days folding cheap synthetic shirts and dealing with rude, angry customers while wearing a hideous, scratchy polyester uniform. The harsh fluorescent lights in the cheap store give her massive daily headaches. Sometimes her former country club friends come into the discount store and intentionally make a huge mess on the sales floor, just so they can stand back and watch the formerly arrogant Tiana clean it all up. She is completely financially ruined and entirely socially exiled. She has no friends left and no wealthy husband to bail her out. Tiana has to ride a crowded public bus for 2 hours every single day just to get to her miserable minimum wage job because her gleaming luxury sports car was aggressively repossessed by the bank. She finally understands what it feels like to truly struggle and scrape by. But she has absolutely no one to blame but her own bottomless greed and malicious cruelty. While they drown in the miserable daily consequences of their own dark choices, I have built an entirely new universe for myself and my daughter. I sold my modest suburban house and purchased an expansive, highly secure luxury penthouse located at the very top of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The massive floors are covered in imported white Italian marble, and we have our own private elevator access guarded by an elite private security team 24 hours a day. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offer a breathtaking, unobstructed panoramic view of the entire sprawling city skyline. The natural golden sunlight pours into the massive living room every single morning, filling our beautiful home with immense warmth and profound peace. There are no heavy shadows here, and there are absolutely no secrets waiting to destroy us in the dark. I sit on a plush velvet sofa, watching my beautiful 2-year-old daughter, Amari, play happily on a thick imported silk rug. She is giggling softly to herself as she carefully stacks a set of brightly colored wooden blocks into a tall, wobbly tower. She is surrounded by safe educational toys and eats organic meals prepared daily by our private chef. She is completely safe and completely loved. She will never know the dark, toxic manipulation of the people who share her genetic material. The absolute joy and pure innocence shining on her beautiful face is my greatest daily reward. She will grow up in a bright world where she is deeply valued and fiercely protected by a mother who would gladly burn down the entire world to keep her safe. I hold my encrypted phone to my ear, listening to the crisp, professional voice of Harrison on the other end of the secure line. We are currently finalizing the complex details of another massive multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. I recently expanded my anonymous holding company to aggressively purchase and restructure several struggling commercial real estate firms across the entire southern region. Harrison tells me he successfully acquired the exact commercial real estate firm that Winston used to work closely with for decades. I smile, a very cold, deeply satisfied smile. I instruct Harrison to immediately liquidate all of the firm's luxury commercial assets and completely convert their massive suburban properties into affordable community housing projects. Harrison laughs over the phone and tells me the opposing board of directors has completely folded and accepted all of my aggressive buyout terms without a single alteration. I tell Harrison he did an excellent job and instruct him to wire the final acquisition funds before the banking markets close for the weekend. I end the secure call and toss the expensive phone onto a polished marble coffee table. I do not even look at the glowing screen as the massive financial transaction completely finalizes in the background. Money is simply a tool I use to construct the high, impenetrable walls around my peaceful kingdom. I slide off the plush sofa and sit down on the soft rug right next to Amari. She looks up at me with her big, bright eyes and offers me a solid blue wooden block with a massive, joyful smile. I take the small block from her tiny hands and gently help her place it at the very top of her growing tower. I pull her into my arms and hold her close, breathing in the sweet, innocent scent of her soft hair. I stand up smoothly, carrying her warm, familiar weight against my chest, and walk slowly toward the massive glass windows. We look out together over the vast, glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline as the afternoon sun begins to set, casting brilliant streaks of orange and purple across the gathering clouds. I place my free hand against the warm, solid glass and take a very deep, calming breath. I think about the terrified, exhausted woman I was exactly 1 year ago, holding a heavy wooden baseball bat in the dark and waiting for a monster to kick down my nursery door. That weak, frightened woman is completely gone forever. I lost a highly toxic and deeply dangerous biological family. But in exchange, I built a massive, unshakable corporate empire. I secured my ultimate permanent peace, and I flawlessly protected my innocent child from the vicious people who wanted to throw her to the hungry wolves. The bright city lights begin to flicker on one by one in the distance, mirroring the quiet, steady strength burning deep inside my own chest. I hold my beautiful daughter a little bit tighter and smile a genuine, peaceful smile as the bright golden sun finally dips completely below the horizon. The dark, dangerous shadows can never reach us up here. The screen slowly fades to a deep, peaceful, absolute black. The most profound lesson from Erica's journey is that true family is defined by loyalty and protection, not simply by shared bloodlines. When the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally become your greatest threat, walking away is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of ultimate self-preservation. Erica teaches us that our self-worth should never be tied to the validation of toxic relatives. Real power comes from building your own independent setting, impenetrable boundaries, and recognizing that losing a toxic environment is actually the greatest victory. You are the architect of your own peace. If you've ever had to build strong boundaries to protect your peace from toxic people, hit the like button and share your story in the comments below.